Chapter 4. What to buy. Applying this to your own needs. The average investor is not a specialist in the field of investment. If a man, he usually gives but a tiny fraction of the time or mental effort to handling his investments that he devotes to his own work. If a woman, the time and effort given to investments is equally small compared to that devoted to her normal duties. The result is that the typical investor has usually gathered a good deal of the half-truths, misconceptions, and just plain bunk that the general public has gradually accumulated about successful investing. One of the most widespread and least accurate of such ideas is the popular conception of what traits are needed to be an investment wizard. If a public opinion poll were taken on this subject, I suspect John Q. Public's composite picture of such an expert would be an introverted, bookish individual with an accounting-type mind. This scholastic-like investment expert would sit all day in undisturbed isolation poring over vast quantities of balance sheets, corporate earnings statements, and trade statistics. From these, his superior intellect and deep understanding of figures would glean information not available to the ordinary mortal. This type of cloistered study would yield invaluable knowledge about the location of magnificent investments. Like so many other widespread misconceptions, this mental picture has just enough accuracy to make it highly dangerous for anyone wanting to get the greatest long-range benefit from common stocks. As already pointed out in the discussion of the 15 points to be considered if a major investment winner is to be selected by any means other than pure luck, a few of these matters are largely determined by cloistered mathematical calculation. Furthermore, as mentioned near the beginning of this book, there is more than one method by which an investor, if sufficiently skilled, can over the years make some money, occasionally even really worthwhile money, through investment. The purpose of this book is not to point out every way such money can be made. Rather, it is to point out the best way. By the best way is meant the greatest total profit for the least risk. The type of accounting statistical activity which the general public seems to visualize as the heart of successful investing will, if enough effort be given it, turn up some apparent bargains. Some of these may be real bargains. In the case of others, there may be such acute business troubles lying ahead, yet not discernible from a purely statistical study, that instead of being bargains they are actually selling at prices which in a few years will have proven to be very high. Meanwhile, in the case of even the genuine bargain, the degree by which it is undervalued is usually somewhat limited. The time it takes to get adjusted to its true value is frequently considerable. So far as I have been able to observe, this means that over a time sufficient to give a fair comparison, say 5 years, the most skilled statistical bargain hunter ends up with a profit which is but a small part of the profit attained by those using reasonable intelligence in appraising the business characteristics of superbly managed growth companies. This, of course, is after charging the growth stock investor with losses on ventures which did not turn out as expected and charging the bargain hunter for a proportionate amount of bargains that just didn't turn out. The reason why the growth stocks do so much better is that they seem to show gains in value in the hundreds of % each decade. In contrast, it is an unusual bargain that is as much as 50% undervalued. The cumulative effect of this simple arithmetic should be obvious. At this point, the potential investor may have to start revising his ideas about the amount of time needed to locate the right investments for his purpose, to say nothing of the characteristics he must have if he is to find them. Perhaps he looked forward to spending a few hours each week in the comfort of his home, studying scads of written material which he felt would unlock the door to worthwhile profits. He just does not have the time to seek out, cultivate, and talk with all the various people it might be wise to contact if he wants to handle his common stock investments to his optimum benefit. Perhaps he does have the time. He still may not have the inclination and personality to seek out and chat with a group of people, most of whom he previously had not known very well, if at all. Furthermore, it is not enough just to chat with them. It is necessary to arouse their interest and their confidence to a point where they will tell what they know. The successful investor is usually an individual who is inherently interested in business problems. This results in his discussing such matters in a way that will arouse the interest of those from whom he is seeking data. Naturally, he must have reasonably good judgment, or all the data he gets will avail him nothing. An investor may have the time, inclination, and judgment but still be blocked from getting maximum results in the handling of his common stocks. The matter of geography is also a factor. An investor, for example, living in or near Detroit would have opportunities for learning about automotive accessory and parts companies that would not be available to one equally diligent or able in Oregon. but so many major companies and industries are today organized on a nationwide basis with distribution, if not manufacturing, centers in most key cities, that investors living in larger industrial centers or their suburbs usually have ample opportunities to practice the art of finding at least a few outstanding long-range investments. This unfortunately is not equally true for those living in rural areas remote from such centers. However, the rural investor or the overwhelming majority of other investors who may not have the time, inclination, or ability to uncover outstanding investments for themselves are by no means barred from making such investments because of this. Actually, the investor's work is so specialized and so intricate that there is no more reason why an individual should handle his own investments than that he should be his own lawyer, doctor, architect, or automobile mechanic. He should perform these functions if he has special interest in and skill at the particular field. Otherwise, he definitely should go to an expert. What is important is that he know enough of the principles involved so that he can pick a real expert rather than a hack or a charlatan. In some ways, it is easier for a careful layman to pick an outstanding investment advisor than, say, a comparably superior doctor or lawyer. In other ways, it is much harder. It is harder because the investment field has developed much more recently than most comparable specialties. As a result, mass ideas have not yet crystallized to the point where there is an accepted line of demarcation between true knowledge and mumbo-jumbo. There are not as yet the barriers to weed out the ignorant and the incompetent in the financial field that exist, for example, in the fields of law or medicine. Even among some of the so-called authorities on investment, there is still enough lack of agreement on the basic principles involved that it is as yet impossible to have schools for training investment experts comparable to the recognized schools for teaching law or medicine. This makes even more remote the practicability of government authorities licensing those having the necessary background of knowledge to guide others in investments in a manner comparable to the way our states license the practicing of law or medicine. It is true that many of our states do go through the form of licensing investment advisors. However, in such instances only known dishonesty or financial insolvency rather than a lack of training or skill provides the basis for denying a license. All this probably results in a higher percentage of incompetence among financial advisors than may exist in fields such as law and medicine. However, there are compensating factors that can enable an individual with no personal expertness in investments to pick a capable financial advisor more easily than a comparably outstanding doctor or lawyer. Finding out which physician had lost the smallest percentage of his practice through deaths would not be a good way to pick a superb doctor. Neither would a corresponding box score of cases won and lost show the relative skill of attorneys. Fortunately, most medical treatments are not matters of immediate life or death, and a good lawyer will frequently avoid going into litigation at all. In the investment advisor's case, it is quite different, however. There is a scoreboard that, after enough time has elapsed, should pretty much reflect that advisor's investment skill. In occasional cases, it may take as much as 5 years for investments to demonstrate their real merit. Usually, it does not take that long. It would normally be foolhardy for anyone to entrust his savings to the skill of a so-called advisor who, working either for himself or others, had less than 5 years' experience. Therefore, in the case of investments, there is no reason why those trying to pick a professional advisor should not demand to see a fair cross-section of results obtained for others. Those results, compared to a record of security prices for the same period of time, give a real clue to the advisor's ability. 2 more steps are then necessary before an investor should make final determination of the individual or organization to which he will delegate the important responsibility for his funds. One is the obvious step of being certain of that advisor's complete and unquestioned honesty. The other step is more complex. A financial advisor may have obtained far above average results during a period of falling prices not because of skill but because he always keeps a large part of the funds he manages in, let us say, high-grade bonds. At another time, after a long period of rising prices, another advisor may have obtained above-average results because of a tendency to go into risky, marginal companies. As explained in the discussion of profit margins, such companies usually do well only in such a period and subsequently do rather poorly. Still, a third advisor might do well in both such periods because of a tendency to try to guess what the security markets are going to do. This can produce magnificent results for a while, but is almost impossible to continue indefinitely. Before selecting an advisor, an investor should learn from that advisor the nature of his basic concept of financial management. He should then only accept an advisor with concepts fundamentally the same as the investor's own. Naturally, I believe that the concepts expressed in this book are those which fundamentally should govern. Many, reared in the old-time financial atmosphere of buy them when they are cheap and sell them when they are high, would strongly disagree with this conclusion. Assuming an investor desires the type of huge, long-range gain which I believe should be the objective of nearly all common stock purchases, there is one matter which he must decide for himself: whether he uses an investment advisor or handles his own affairs. It is a decision which must be made because the type of stocks which qualify most satisfactorily under the previously discussed 15 points can vary considerably among themselves in their investment characteristics. At one end of the scale are large companies which, in spite of outstanding prospects of major further growth, are so financially strong, with roots going so deep into the economic soil, that they qualify under the general classification of institutional stocks. This means that insurance companies, professional trustees, and similar institutional buyers will buy them. They will do so because they feel that, while they may misjudge market prices and could lose a part of their original investment should they be forced to sell such stocks at a time of lower quotations, they are avoiding the greater danger of loss they could suffer if they bought into a company that subsequently fell from its present competitive position. The Dow Chemical Company, DuPont, and International Business Machines are good examples of this type of growth stock. In Chapter 1, I mentioned the totally insignificant return available from high-grade bonds during the 10-year period 1946 to 1956. At the close of this period, each of these three stocks, Dow, DuPont, and IBM, had a value approximately 5 times what it sold for at the beginning of the period. Nor during these 10 years did their holders suffer from the standpoint of current income. Dow, for example, is almost notorious for the low rate of return it customarily pays on current market price. Yet the investor who bought Dow at the start of this period would at the end of it be doing well from the standpoint of current income. Although Dow at the time of purchase would only have provided a return of about 2.5%, this was a period when yields on all stocks were high. Just 10 years later, it had increased dividends or split stock so many times that the investor would have been enjoying a dividend return of between 8 and 9% on the price of his investment 10 years earlier. More significantly, the 10-year period covered is not an unusual one for companies of the caliber of these three. Decade after decade, with only occasional interruptions from such one-time influences as the great 1929 to 1932 bear market or World War II, these stocks have given almost fabulous performance. At the other end of the scale, also of extreme interest for the right sort of long-range investment, are small and frequently young companies which may only have total sales of from $1 to $6 or $7 million per annum, but which also have products that might bring a sensational future. To qualify under the 15 points already described, such companies will usually have a combination of outstanding business management and equally capable scientific personnel who are pioneering in a new or economically promising field. The Ampex Corporation, at the time the stock was first offered to the public in 1953, might serve as a good example of this type of company. Within 4 years, the value of the stock had increased over 7-fold. Between these two extremes lie a host of other promising growth companies, varying all the way from those as young and risky as was Ampex in 1953 to those as strong and well-entrenched as are Dow, DuPont, and IBM today. Assuming it is time to buy it all, see the next chapter. Which type should the investor buy? The young growth stock offers by far the greatest possibility of gain. Sometimes this can mount up to several thousand% in a decade. But making at least an occasional investment mistake is inevitable even for the most skilled investor. It should never be forgotten that if such a mistake is made in this type of common stock, every dollar put into the investment can be lost. In contrast, if the stock is bought according to the rules described in the next chapter, any losses that might occur in the older and more established growth stocks should be temporary, resulting from a period of unanticipated decline in the stock market as a whole. The long-range gain in value of this class of big company growth stock will, over the years, be considerably less than that of the small and usually younger enterprise. Nevertheless, it will mount to thoroughly worthwhile totals. Even in the most conservative of the growth stocks, it should run to at least several times the original investment. Therefore, for anyone risking a stake big enough to be of real significance to himself or his family, the rule to follow should be rather obvious. It is to put most of his funds into the type of company which, while perhaps not as large as a Dow, a DuPont, or an International Business Machines, at least comes closer to that type of stock than to the small young company. Whether this most be 60% or 100% of total investments varies with the needs or requirements of each individual. A widow with $500,000 of total assets and no children might put all her funds in the more conservative class of growth stocks. Another widow with $1 million to invest and 3 children for whom she would like to increase her assets to a degree that would not, however, jeopardize her scale of living, might well put up to 15% of her assets in carefully selected small young companies. A businessman with a wife, 2 children, a present investment worth $400,000, and an income big enough to save $10,000 per annum after taxes might put all his present $400,000 into the more conservative type growth companies but venture the $10,000 of new savings each year on the more risky half of the investment scale. In all these cases, however, the gain in value over the years of the more conservative group of stocks should be enough to outweigh even complete loss of all funds put into the more risky type. Meanwhile, if properly selected, the more risky type could significantly increase the total capital gain. Equally important if this happens, these young risky companies will by that time have reached a point in their own development where their stocks will no longer be carrying anything like the former degree of risk but may even have progressed to a status where institutions have begun buying them. The problems of the small investor are somewhat more difficult. The large investor can often completely ignore the matter of dividend returns in his endeavor to employ all his funds in situations affording maximum growth potential. After his funds are so invested, he may still obtain from them sufficient dividends either to take care of his desired standard of living or to enable him to attain this standard if the dividend income is added to his other regular earning power. Most small investors cannot live on the return on their investment no matter how high a yield is obtained, since the total value of their holdings is not great enough. Therefore, for the small investor, the matter of current dividend return usually comes down to a choice between a few $100s a year starting right now or the chance of obtaining an income many times this few $100s a year at a later date. Before reaching a decision on this crucial point, there is one matter which the small investor should face squarely. This is that the only funds he should consider using for common stock investment are funds that are truly surplus. This does not mean using all funds that remain over and above what he needs for everyday living expense. Except in the most unusual circumstances, he should have a backlog of several $1,000s sufficient to take care of illnesses or other unexpected contingencies before attempting to buy anything with as much intrinsic risk as a common stock. Similarly, funds already set aside for some specific future purpose, such as sending a child through college, should never be risked in the stock market. It is only after taking care of matters of this sort that he should consider common stock investment. The objective which the small investor then has for this surplus becomes somewhat a matter of personal choice and of his particular circumstances, including the size and nature of his other income. A young man or woman or an older investor with children or other heirs of whom he or she is particularly fond may be willing to sacrifice a dividend income of, say, $30 or $40 a month in order to obtain an income 10 times that size in 15 years. In contrast, an elderly person with no close heirs would naturally prefer a larger immediate income. Similarly, a person earning a relatively small income and with heavy financial obligations might have no choice but to provide for immediate needs. However, for the great majority of small investors, the decision on the importance of immediate income is one of personal choice. It probably is largely dependent on the psychology of each individual investor. My own purely personal view is that a small amount of additional income after taxes palls in comparison to an investment that in the years ahead could bring me a sizable income and, in time, might make my children really wealthy. Others may feel quite differently about this. It is to the large investor and to the small investor who feels as I do on this subject and desires an intelligent approach to the principles that have made these kinds of results possible that the procedures set forth in this book are presented. The success which any particular individual will have in applying these principles to his own investments will depend on 2 things. One is the degree of skill with which he applies them. The other is, of course, the matter of good fortune. In an age when an unforeseeable discovery might happen tomorrow in a research laboratory in no way connected with the company in which the investment has been made, And in an age when 5 years from now that unrelated research development could result in either tripling or cutting in half the profits of this investment, good fortune obviously can play a tremendous part so far as any one investment is concerned. This is why even the medium-sized investor has an advantage over those of very small means. This element of good or bad fortune will largely average out if several well-selected investments are chosen. However, for both large and small investors who prefer far greater income some years from now to maximum possible return today, it is well to remember that during the past 35 years numerous studies have been made by various financial authorities. These have compared the results obtained from the purchase of common stocks which afford a high dividend yield with those obtained from the purchase of low-yield stocks of companies that have concentrated on growth and the reinvestment of assets. As far as I know, every one of these studies has shown the same trend. The growth stocks over a 5 or 10-year span have proven spectacularly better so far as their increase in capital value is concerned. More surprising, in the same time span such stocks have usually so increased their dividends that, while still paying a low return in relation to the enhanced value at which they were by then selling, they were by this time paying a greater dividend return on the original investment than were the stocks selected for yield alone. In other words, the growth stocks had not only shown a marked superiority in the field of capital appreciation, but given a reasonable time, they had grown to a point where they showed superiority in the matter of dividend return as well.